Hey there, fellow travelers and thrill seekers. Thanks for hopping aboard for this wild ride of a story. If you're new around here, I'd love it if you'd hit that subscribe button. It really keeps these tales chugging along. And while you're at it, drop a comment below and let me know where you're tuning in from. I'm Emma Harper, just a regular gal who thought she'd scored a sweet deal on a train ride home. But oh boy, was I in for a twist I never saw coming. So, settle into your seats, maybe grab a snack, and let's dive into this one together. Here's how it all started. I remember stepping onto that train like it was the cherry on top of a long, grueling week. I'd been hustling in the city, chasing deadlines as a freelance journalist, and I was ready to kick back and head home to the quiet little town I grew up in. It was one of those late-night departures, the kind where the station feels more like a ghost town than a bustling hub. The air was crisp, the platform nearly deserted, just a few stragglers dragging suitcases or sipping coffee from paper cups. I'd booked a cheap ticket ages ago, but when I checked in at the counter, the clerk flashed me a smile and said, "You're in luck, ma'am. We've got an open seat in the deluxe car. Your upgrade's on us." I couldn't believe it. Deluxe car? Me? I felt like I'd won the lottery, or at least a really good raffle at a county fair. Little did I know the universe was tossing me a bone because it had some seriously wild plans up its sleeve. Walking down the platform toward the train, I could already feel the buzz of excitement in my chest. I've always loved trains. There's something about the rhythm of the tracks, the way the world blurs past the windows, that gets me every time. Sure, some folks get jittery about being cooped up in a metal tube hurtling through the night. But for me, it's pure magic. An adventure waiting to happen. That night, though, the station had this weird stillness to it. No announcements blaring over the speakers, no rush of last-minute passengers. Just the soft hum of the train's engine and the occasional clack of a suitcase wheel on the concrete. I brushed it off as the late hour and kept moving, my boots echoing louder than I expected as I hauled my duffel bag toward the deluxe car entrance. When I stepped inside, it was like walking into a different world. The deluxe car was everything I dreamed it'd be and more. The lights were low and warm, casting a golden glow over everything. The seats weren't those stiff, cramped rows you'd find in coach. They were wide, cushy armchairs upholstered in dark leather, each one with its own little side table and a privacy curtain you could pull if you wanted to shut out the world. The air smelled faintly of cedar and coffee, and the carpet underfoot was so plush I almost felt bad stepping on it with my scuffed-up boots. I found my spot, seat 7A, right by a big window, and dropped my bag onto the floor with a satisfied sigh. The chair practically hugged me as I sank into it, and there was even a little folded blanket waiting, soft as a cloud, with the railway's logo stitched into one corner. I was grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. This was going to be the best ride home ever. I wasn't alone in the car, though it was pretty sparse for a Friday night. Across the aisle, a guy in a sharp suit, James, I'd later learn, nodded politely as he scrolled through his phone. He had that polished look of someone who flew business class more often than he rode trains, complete with a fancy watch that caught the light every time he moved. A few rows ahead, an older lady with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, Mrs. Edith, as she'd introduce herself, settled in with a paperback and a thermos she'd brought from home. And then there was Liam, a scruffy guy about my age, sprawled out in the back corner with oversized headphones clamped over his ears, bobbing his head to some beat I couldn't hear. We all exchanged those quick, awkward smiles you give strangers you're about to share a space with, and then we went back to our own little worlds. A conductor popped in not long after, a cheerful woman with a braided ponytail and a name tag that read Clara. She handed me a glass of sparkling water with a slice of lemon floating in it, like I was at some fancy restaurant instead of a train car. "Anything else you need, just holler," she said with a wink before moving on to check tickets. I took a sip, the bubbles tickling my nose, and leaned back, letting the luxury of it all wash over me. I was ready to unwind. Maybe listen to a podcast or flip through the magazine I'd stuffed in my bag. The train hadn't even started moving yet, and I was already feeling like royalty. Just before I switched my phone to airplane mode, old habit from flying, I guess, I noticed a notification pop up. It was one of those emergency alerts, the kind that blares out of nowhere and makes your heart skip a beat. I tapped it open, expecting maybe a weather warning or an Amber Alert. Instead, the screen lit up with blocky red text. Emergency alert. Unidentified outbreak detected. Avoid close contact. Stay indoors if possible. I blinked at it, my thumb hovering over the screen. An outbreak? What kind of outbreak? It sounded like something out of a sci-fi movie, not a real-life Friday night. I glanced around, half expecting Clara to come back and say it was a prank, but she was busy chatting with James up front. The other passengers didn't seem fazed. Liam was still lost in his music. Mrs. Edith was turning a page in her book. My brain started spinning, but I shook it off. Probably a glitch, I told myself. Or some overzealous public health announcement gone haywire. I'd figure it out when I got home. With a quick swipe, I turned off my phone and tucked it into my pocket, determined to enjoy the ride. The train gave a little jolt, and we were off. The platform slid away outside my window, replaced by the dark smear of the city outskirts. The wheels clacked against the tracks in that steady, soothing rhythm I loved so much, and the car rocked gently as we picked up speed. I pulled the blanket over my lap, the soft fabric warming my legs, and dug out my earbuds. I downloaded a true crime podcast earlier that week. Perfect for a night ride, I thought. The lights in the car dimmed just a touch, enough to make the space feel cozy without plunging us into darkness. Clara came by again, this time with a tray of little pastries, offering them around like we were at a cocktail party. I grabbed a flaky croissant, thanked her, and popped an earbud in, ready to lose myself in someone else's story for a while. About 20 minutes in, I was munching on the croissant, still warm, with a hint of butter that practically melted in my mouth, when the overhead speaker crackled to life. I yanked out an earbud, startled, as a man's voice filled the car. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your train manager speaking. We've just received some unusual updates from Central Dispatch. Nothing to worry about yet, but please stay in your seats and follow any instructions from the crew. Thank you." His tone was calm, professional, the kind of voice you'd hear telling you about a delay due to track maintenance. But there was something in it, a tiny waver, maybe, that made my stomach tighten. I looked around again. James had set his phone down, frowning slightly. Mrs. Edith glanced up from her book, her brows knitting together. Liam didn't budge, still grooving to whatever was pumping through his headphones. "What do you think that's about?" I whispered to no one in particular, mostly just to break the weird silence that followed. James caught my eye and shrugged. "Probably nothing," he said, adjusting his cufflinks. "Trains get weird messages all the time, signal issues, weather stuff." His voice was steady, but he didn't go back to his phone right away. Mrs. Edith leaned over a little, her thermos cradled in her hands. "I hope it's not a delay," she said softly. "I've got my grandson waiting for me at the other end." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, fingers crossed it's just a hiccup." Clara walked through again, her braids swinging as she moved. She didn't offer pastries this time, though. She was talking quietly into a little radio clipped to her uniform, her lips pressed tight. I couldn't catch the words, but the way she kept glancing toward the back of the car, where a thick curtain separated us from the coach section, set my nerves on edge. I told myself to chill out. It was a long ride, plenty of time for things to sort themselves out. I popped my earbud back in, hit play on the podcast, and tried to focus on the narrator's voice recounting some decades-old mystery. But that alert kept nagging at me, flickering in the back of my mind like a bad dream I couldn't shake. The train rolled on, the city lights thinning out as we slipped into the countryside. The windows reflected the warm glow of the car now, making it harder to see outside. I adjusted my blanket, settling deeper into the seat, and took another bite of the croissant. Whatever was going on, I figured it couldn't touch me here, wrapped up in this little bubble of comfort. The deluxe car felt like a fortress, a world apart from whatever chaos might be brewing elsewhere. At least, that's what I told myself as the tracks hummed beneath us, carrying me and everyone else into the night. About an hour into the ride, I was still nestled in my plush seat, the podcast droning on about some cold case I was only half listening to. The train's steady clack-clack had lulled me into a kind of trance, the croissant long gone, crumbs dusting my blanket. The deluxe car was quiet, save for the soft rustle of Mrs. Edith turning pages and the faint tap of James's fingers on his phone. Liam was still zoned out in his headphones, oblivious to the world. Outside, the windows showed nothing but inky blackness now, the last traces of city lights swallowed up by the countryside. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful, like the calm before a storm you don't even know is coming. Then it hit me, not a storm, but a feeling. That emergency alert from earlier was still gnawing at me, like a splinter I couldn't dig out. I pulled my phone from my pocket, even though I knew it wouldn't have a signal out here in the middle of nowhere. The screen glowed in the dim light, still showing that eerie red text. Unidentified outbreak detected. Avoid close contact. I stared at it again, willing it to make sense. Maybe it was a typo, or some overhyped flu warning. But, outbreak? That word carried weight, conjuring up images of hazmat suits and quarantines, not something you'd expect on a random Friday night train ride. I flicked the screen off and shoved the phone back in my pocket, telling myself I was overreacting. Still, my eyes darted toward Clara, the conductor, who'd been pacing more than usual. She was up near the front of the car now, talking into her radio again. Her voice was too low to catch, but her posture, shoulders hunched, one hand gripping the radio like it was a lifeline, didn't scream, "Everything's fine." I leaned forward a little, trying to eavesdrop, when a sound cut through the quiet. It wasn't loud, not at first, just a low, rumbling groan from somewhere behind the thick curtain that separated our deluxe car from the coach section. I froze, my earbuds slipping out as I strained to listen. It came again, deeper this time, like someone moaning in pain or exhaustion. My stomach twisted. Was someone sick back there? Maybe drunk? I glanced at James, who'd set his phone down again, his brow furrowed. Mrs. Edith looked up too, her book resting in her lap. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, mostly to James since he was closest. He nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "Yeah, doesn't sound good." Before I could say anything else, Clara hurried over to the curtain, her braid bouncing with each quick step. She didn't pull it aside, just stood there, head cocked like she was listening to. The groan faded, replaced by a faint thud, like something heavy dropping to the floor. My pulse kicked up a notch. I told myself it was nothing, just some rowdy passenger or a suitcase falling from a rack. But that alert kept flashing in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Clara turned back to us, her face a little paler than before. "Folks, just stay put, all right?" she said, her voice steady but strained, like she was trying to convince herself as much as us. "We've got a little situation in the back, nothing to worry about. I'll handle it." She flashed a tight smile and disappeared behind the curtain, the fabric swaying shut behind her. The car went silent again, but it wasn't the comfortable kind of quiet anymore. It was thick, heavy, like the air was holding its breath. James shifted in his seat, muttering something under his breath about poor service. Mrs. Edith clutched her thermos closer, her knuckles whitening. Liam, bless him, hadn't noticed a thing, still bobbing his head like he was at a private concert. I tried to focus on my podcast again, but the narrator's voice felt distant, drowned out by the questions swirling in my head. What kind of situation needed handling at this hour? And why did Clara look so rattled? The train rocked gently as we rounded a curve, the wheels singing their steady song, but it didn't soothe me like before. Another sound drifted through the curtain, this time a sharp clatter, like metal hitting the floor, followed by a muffled shout. My heart jumped. I yanked out my other earbud and sat up straight, eyes locked on that curtain. Something was definitely wrong. A minute later, Clara burst back into the deluxe car, her radio crackling with static. She wasn't alone this time. Another crew member, a wiry guy with a clipboard, trailed behind her, his face slick with sweat. They huddled near the front, whispering fast and frantic. I caught snippets, not responding, locked the door, don't know how many. My reporter instincts kicked in. I wanted to march up there and demand answers, but my legs felt like lead. James beat me to it. He stood up, all 6 feet of him looming in the aisle, and called out, "Hey, what's going on back there?" "We deserve to know." Clara spun around, her eyes wide for a split second before she plastered that fake calm smile back on. "Sir, please take your seat. It's under control, just a passenger causing a bit of trouble. We're sorting it out." Her words sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced them in front of a mirror. James didn't buy it. "Trouble?" he snapped, adjusting his tie. That didn't sound like some drunk guy mouthing off. "What aren't you telling us?" The wiry crew guy stepped forward, holding up a hand. "Look, man, we've got it handled. Sit down, all right? No need to make this a thing." But it was already a thing. The overhead speaker crackled again, and the train manager's voice came through, rougher this time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a minor disturbance in the rear cars. Please remain seated and follow crew instructions. We'll update you soon." The line went dead, and a murmur rippled through our little group. Mrs. Edith leaned toward me, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you think it's serious, dear?" I wanted to say no, to tell her it was just some jerk making a scene, but the truth was, I didn't know. "Probably not," I lied, giving her hand a quick pat. She nodded, but her eyes stayed worried. Then it happened, a scream. Not a loud, dramatic one like in the movies, but a short, sharp cry that cut off as fast as it started. It came from behind the curtain, and this time, even Liam noticed. He yanked off his headphones, blinking like he'd just woken up. "What the hell was that?" he said, loud enough that Clara flinched. She didn't answer, just darted back to the curtain with the wiry guy in tow. I couldn't sit still anymore. My heart was hammering, and every instinct screamed at me to do something, anything. I slid out of my seat, ignoring Clara's earlier warning, and crept toward the curtain. James followed, his shadow falling over me as we moved. I reached the edge of the fabric, my fingers brushing the heavy weave. Another sound came through, low, guttural, almost animalistic. My breath caught. I hesitated, then gently pulled the curtain aside, just an inch, enough to peek through. The coach car was dimmer than ours, the overhead lights flickering like they were on their last legs. Most of the seats were empty, but I saw shapes moving slow, unsteady shapes. One guy was slumped in an aisle seat, his head lolling at a weird angle. Another figure was crouched near the back, rummaging through a bag, their movements jerky and frantic. Then I saw Clara and the wiry guy near the rear galley, struggling with someone. The person was thrashing, arms flailing like they were fighting for their life, or something else. I couldn't see their face, but the way they moved wasn't right. Too fast, too wild. The curtain slipped from my fingers as Clara shoved the person back, shouting something I couldn't make out. The fabric swung shut, but not before James caught a glimpse too. "What the hell is going on?" he hissed, his voice low and urgent. I didn't have an answer. My mind raced back to that alert, outbreak, avoid close contact, and a cold dread settled in my gut. This wasn't just a rowdy passenger. This was something else. Before we could process it, the speaker blared again. "Folks, this is your train manager. We've got a bigger issue in the back than expected. Stay where you are. Lock any doors you can. We're working on it." The line cut off, and the deluxe car erupted into whispers. Liam was on his feet now, clutching his headphones like a weapon. Mrs. Edith was pale, her thermos trembling in her hands. James stormed toward the front, demanding Clara explain, but she was already back behind the curtain, her radio spitting static. I sank back into my seat, my hands shaking. The train kept rolling, the tracks humming beneath us, but the comfort of the deluxe car was gone. That groan, that scream, those shapes, they weren't normal. And as the lights flickered overhead, I couldn't help but wonder if whatever was happening back there was tied to that cryptic alert. We were trapped on this train, speeding through the night, and the walls of my little fortress were starting to feel a lot thinner than before. The train kept humming along, The steady clack of the wheels a cruel tease of normalcy, while everything else unraveled. I was back in my seat, my blanket bunched up in my fists like it could shield me from whatever was brewing behind that curtain. The deluxe car wasn't quiet anymore. James was pacing the aisle, muttering about lawsuits, while Liam had his ear pressed to the wall, trying to catch any sound from the coach section. Mrs. Edith sat rigid, her paperback forgotten, her thermos clutched like a talisman. The lights overhead buzzed and flickered every few minutes, casting long shadows that made the car feel smaller, tighter, like it was closing in on us. Clara and the wiry crew guy hadn't come back since they'd disappeared behind the curtain again, and the silence from the rear was worse than the screams. At least the noise had given us something to focus on. Now, it was just this suffocating void, broken only by the occasional thud or shuffle that made us all flinch. My mind kept replaying what I'd seen through that gap. Those jerky movements, the vacant slump of that passenger, the way Clara had wrestled with someone who didn't seem human anymore. That emergency alert, unidentified outbreak, avoid close contact, wasn't just a glitch. It was real, and it was here, on this train with us. The speaker crackled again, and we all snapped to attention. The train manager's voice came through, rough and tired. "Folks, we're still dealing with the situation in the rear cars. We can't make it to our main stop. Reports say it's locked down tight. We're rerouting to a smaller station up ahead. Stay put, keep calm. We'll get through this." The line went dead, and a ripple of panic swept through the car. James stopped pacing, his fists clenched. "Locked down? What does that even mean?" He barked at no one in particular. Liam pulled away from the wall, his face pale. "Dude, I heard something back there, like groaning, but not normal. Like horror movie level stuff." Mrs. Edith looked at me, her eyes wide. "Emma, do you think it's contagious?" Her voice trembled, and I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell her no, to keep her calm, but my gut was screaming otherwise. I forced a shrug, my mouth dry. Maybe it's just a few sick people. The crew's got it handled. It was a weak lie, and she knew it. But she nodded anyway, clinging to the hope. James wasn't having it. He stormed toward the front of the car, where a small service door led to the crew area. "I'm not sitting here waiting to find out," he snapped, banging on the door. "Hey, tell us what's really going on." No answer came, just the faint hiss of the train's ventilation system. He kicked the door once, hard, then slumped back into his seat, running a hand through his hair. The guy was unraveling, and I couldn't blame him. We were all on edge, teetering between fear and frustration. The train slowed, a subtle shift in the rhythm of the tracks. I glanced out the window, but the darkness was still thick, broken only by faint pinpricks of light in the distance, like a scattering of stars fallen to earth. Were we nearing that smaller station? My stomach twisted at the thought. Landing somewhere sounded better than being stuck in limbo, but what if the ground was worse than the train? That alert had said stay indoors, and we were about to step right out into whatever mess was waiting. I reached for my bag, digging through it on instinct. My phone was dead now, battery drained from earlier, so I grabbed a pen and my notebook instead. If things went south, at least I could scribble down what happened, assuming anyone would ever find it. Another thud from behind the curtain jolted us upright. This one was louder, closer, like something slamming against the wall. Liam grabbed a water bottle from his seat, gripping it like a club. "If they come through, I'm not going down without a fight," he said, his voice shaky but determined. James snorted, but he rummaged in his briefcase and pulled out a fancy metal pen, holding it like a dagger. Mrs. Edith just squeezed her thermos tighter, whispering something that sounded like a prayer. I wrapped my blanket around my shoulders, a flimsy armor, and stood up, my legs wobbling. We were a ragtag crew, armed with whatever we could find, waiting for the unknown. The train lurched, brakes squealing as we slowed to a crawl. The lights flickered again, dimming to a sickly yellow glow. Through the window, I caught glimpses of a platform, small, run down, No bright signs or bustling crowds. Just a single flickering lamp casting long, jagged shadows. The wheels groaned to a stop, and the car fell silent except for our ragged breathing. The speaker stayed dead this time. No update from the manager. Clara burst back into the car, her braid unraveling, sweat beading on her forehead. "We're stopped," she said, her voice tight. "Stay here. I'm checking outside." Before we could ask anything, she grabbed a flashlight from the galley and slipped out the service door, the lock clicking shut behind her. We crowded near the windows, peering into the gloom. The platform was empty. No crew, no passengers, no welcoming lights. Just cracked concrete and a rusty bench tilted on its side. Beyond it, a chain-link fence stretched into the darkness, and past that, nothing but shadows. Clara's flashlight beam bobbed as she stepped onto the platform, sweeping left and right. My heart pounded in my throat. "Where's the station staff?" Liam whispered, his breath fogging the glass. James leaned closer, his watch glinting. "This place looks abandoned. What kind of station is this?" Then we saw it, movement. Not Clara, but something else. Shapes shuffling near the fence, slow and uneven, like drunks staggering home. Except they didn't move like people. Too jerky, too wrong. My skin prickled, a cold sweat breaking out on my neck. Mrs. Edith gasped softly, her hand finding mine and squeezing hard. "Oh Lord, what are they?" she breathed. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Those shapes were too far to make out clearly, but they reminded me of what I'd seen behind the curtain. Unsteady, relentless, not right. Clara's flashlight swung toward the fence, and for a split second, the beam caught one of them. Pale skin, sunken eyes, a mouth hanging open in a silent snarl. It lurched forward, hands clawing at the air, and Clara stumbled back, her light shaking. She bolted for the train, her boots pounding up the steps. The door slammed open, and she tumbled inside, locking it with trembling hands. "It's not safe out there," she panted, her face ashen. "I saw people, but they're not alive. The station's dead. No one's coming." The words hit like a punch. Not alive. My mind flashed to every zombie flick I'd ever laughed at, every late-night story I'd dismissed as nonsense. But this wasn't fiction. This was here, now, on this train and outside it. James swore under his breath. Liam gripped his bottle tighter, and Mrs. Edith started murmuring prayers again. Clara sank against the door, her flashlight clattering to the floor. "The manager's still trying to reach someone," she said, her voice hollow. "But no one's answering. We're staying put for now." Hours dragged by, or maybe it just felt that way. The car was a tomb, the flickering lights our only lifeline. We rationed the last of the pastries and water, passing them around in silence. Every so often, a thud echoed from the coach section, fainter now, like whatever was back there had tired itself out. Or worse, outside, the shapes kept moving, pacing the fence like animals stalking prey. Dawn crept in eventually, a gray smear on the horizon that turned the blackness to a dull, lifeless haze. The light revealed more, dozens of those things, staggering closer, their ragged clothes and blank stares stark against the morning. I scribbled in my notebook, my hand shaking as I wrote. The train was still, the curtain still up, the door still locked. No word from the manager, no rescue in sight. James kept watch at the window, Liam guarded the curtain, and Mrs. Edith held my hand, her grip frail but fierce. We were alive, for now, stuck on this train in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a silence that screamed louder than anything else. So that's where I leave you, folks, pen in hand, heart pounding, waiting for something to break this deadlock. If you're out there, safe and sound, hold on to that. If you're not, well, you get it. Thanks for riding this out with me. Hit that subscribe if you want more, and let me know what you think. Until next time, stay sharp, and maybe keep a flashlight handy. You never know what's lurking in the dark.